It's Wednesday morning. You're awake? Hope you're enjoying the week so far and are ready to look a little bit more into the book of Galatians. As we've kind of Monday, we started this thing. I'm just going to go through the whole book. Obviously not in great deep detail, but just picking out a few nuggets as we go to help us understand how important these issues are that the Apostle Paul is talking about to the the churches of Galatia. The first time we looked at the first 5 verses, and we talked about how that the Apostle Paul established his credentials and that he was wishing grace and peace and how those two things really go together. And then he begins to now attack the problem. And the problem was that Judaizers had come in to the churches of Galatia and began teaching them that in order for them to be saved, in order for them to become a child of God, they needed to basically become a Jew. They need to keep the Mosaic law. They need to adhere themselves to all the Mosaic laws that traditionally were followed by the Jewish people. And this was not the teaching that the Apostle Paul gave them, which was the true teaching of the gospel of Christ. And he recognized the great danger of this. And we're going to kind of think about this more and more as we go through this book of why is it so dangerous to add anything to the message of the gospel of the grace of God. The grace of God. If we add anything to that, why is that so dangerous? Okay, so picking it up in verse 6 of the first chapter of Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, I marvel, he's astounded, right? I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another gospel, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. Okay, so that got us down to verse 10. So, what was happening? The Judaizers were coming in and they were saying, yes, the gospel is for you guys too. But you got to become a Jew. You got to be circumcised if you're a man. You got to keep the Mosaic law. You do those things. You're obedient to those things. Then you can accept the gospel of Jesus Christ and come into an eternal relationship with him. And this was something that Paul had already been battling. And this was a problem on several levels. Today we might look at this as purely a doctrinal issue. You're going to believe it this way or believe that way. But in the early first century, when Christianity was just getting off its feet, this became a huge, cultural and political issue also. Were the Jews going to truly accept the Gentiles into the new faith? Now, Peter had already told them about his experience, how that God showed him when he went to the house of Cornelius, that the gospel was for the Gentile people also. And yet this was a very, very big, huge cultural issue that was there. And there were some that wanted to say, okay, yeah, then come, but they wanted to require them to keep the law. And so now the Apostle Paul has already been battling this. And he's continuing to battle this issue again. And that's why he says, why would you want? I marvel. It's astounding me, he says, that you would so quickly remove yourself from the gospel of the grace of Christ. unto another gospel. Why would you do that? It seems so obvious that if you are accepting the good news from God, that there is grace in Jesus Christ, and that you don't have to do anything to be accepted of God through Christ. All you have to do is truly believe. That's all you have to do. You could not possibly be a good enough person to be accepted of God. And so God said, you don't have to be. I'm going to send my son to be that perfect person that you can't be. And he is going to pay your price for not being that perfect, great, good person. And when you believe in his sacrifice for you, I am going to cover you in my grace, my unmerited favor. I'm going to give you my mercies so that what you truly deserve because of the sin in your life, I'm not going to give you, but instead, you are going to have my everlasting love. Think about that. And Paul's saying, why would you go away from that? And then he gets really, really pointed when he says, listen, if anybody teaches anything else, another gospel is the way I phrase it, but then he kind of goes back and attacks even those words, and he's saying, listen, if anybody preaches another gospel, and I'm telling you, first of all, that other gospel is not the real gospel. It's not the one true gospel. The gospel once delivered to the saints. That message of God is the message of faith and grace that comes through faith from God. That's the true gospel. And if anybody's teaching another gospel, it's not even a true gospel. It's not good news. And yet, all the way from the first century, when they started to have this problem, to today, people have been trying to add to the gospel. And again, I think I talked about this a little bit, Monday. Why? Why do we want to add to? If it does not, scratch the itch that we have, because we all have an itch that says, I'm good enough. I'm a good person. How many times have you heard people say, I think I'm a good person? And one of the tenets of the true gospel of Christ is that you're never going to be good enough for God. And people don't like that part of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ because they want to be good enough. They want to feel like they have earned it. But the gospel says you're never going to earn it. Wow. And so Paul says twice, anybody who teaches any other gospel that's really not a gospel, not a true good news, let him be accursed. Anybody who stands in the way of people through faith receiving the grace and the mercy of God freely deserves to be cursed. Don't ever stand in the way of God's grace, mercy, and love towards all people. And stand in the way of allowing that grace, that mercy, and love to activate to that person who believes it, who honestly, truly believes it. And then Paul says something interesting. He says, listen, in verse 10, for do I now persuade men or God? Do I seek to please men? If Paul wanted to please men, he perhaps would have added something to the gospel. Well, here's what you got to do, man. You commit yourself to this. You live your life this way for the rest of your life. And in the end, God is going to accept you. That's the message that pleases, that scratches that itch. that men want to believe I did something good enough to get into heaven. But Paul says, I'm not trying to please men. I want you to know that you're a sinner, that you always were a sinner, and that after you accept Christ, you're still a sinner by grace, but that sin has no consequences anymore because you simply believe. And when you start to really, really activate that belief in your life, you will suddenly find yourself being a better person than you ever could by believing that what you do is making you acceptable to God. I hope that makes some kind of sense to you. Think about these things. We'll see you Friday morning. God bless.